Welcome to the Grizzly Times podcast with Louisa Wilcox, where we interview scientists, managers, Native Americans, and others who share their experience and perspectives about grizzly bears and their ecosystems. This comes at a critical time in a complex debate about grizzlies, as the government has stripped endangered species protections for Yellowstone grizzlies, allowing trophy hunting, and now moves to do the same for Glacier's grizzlies. We hope that you find the information and views offered here helpful as you shape your own conclusions. This is Louisa Wilcox with Grizzly Times, and I'm here today with Tim Preso, an attorney with Earthjustice, which is a legal organization aimed at saving the earth and the wildlife that depends on it. Wildlife that now more than ever needs a good lawyer. Tim has enjoyed a long and successful career that's far from over. And on August 30th, he argues a critical case involving Yellowstone's grizzly bears and whether or not they should be hunted for trophies beginning on September 1st. So, Tim, you've worked as an environmental attorney for decades now, and maybe you could share just a story or two about what sparked your interest in the environment and moreover, what influenced you to become an environmental attorney?
Yeah, I, like a lot of people, trace that back to outdoors experiences as a young person. I find that over and over, that's a formative moment, and people who get out into the woods as a kid tend to value those things as they become an adult. My own situation was I grew up in northeastern Oregon, and I was on the boundary of the Eagle Cap Wilderness, which is the largest designated wilderness area in Oregon. And I grew up in a kind of a rural community that was pretty much all about kind of ranching and logging and those kinds of things, and those things didn't really resonate with me a lot. But getting out into those trails that headed up into the high country of the Wallowa Mountains did. And so that was a really important experience for me as a young person, getting out into that pristine wilderness land, and that really stuck with me. And then later in life, when I became a newspaper reporter, really through no intention, I ended up covering environmental issues. And it was in the midst of the spotted owl logging controversy. I was in Oregon then as well, in the Pacific Northwest. And what became pretty clear to me quickly was that the lawyers were the ones making a big difference on that issue. And particularly there were lawyers at the scrappy office of a group called the Sierra Club Legal Defense Fund in Seattle, Washington, that were making huge changes in the way the Pacific Northwest forests were managed and saving some of those old-growth forests. And that also made a big impact on me, and so I decided I wanted to go to law school because I wanted to do that. And then subsequently, Sierra Club Legal Defense Fund became Earthjustice, and here I am.
Wonderful. So maybe this goes back to your days in Northeast Oregon, but you have become quite the accomplished naturalist and have a particular passion for birds. Maybe you can share a story or two about one of your favorite birds or maybe favorite birding places.
Sure. Interestingly, my interest in birds really grew out of my time moving back east to go to law school, because I'd grown up in the West and in wild places where there was a lot of wildlife around. It was just kind of part of my baseline expectation of existence. But when I moved back to the East, that didn't exist except in the form of birds. Now I say I'm interested in everything, including birds, but birds do have a special place in my heart. And I would say one bird that stands out for me is when I first moved to Montana in 2000 in March, at the end of a long winter, that first spring was heralded by the cries of sandhill cranes over the valley here. And that was my first time really experiencing that. It's such an evocative sound, and it speaks to so much about wildness and species like the crane that makes these immense seasonal movements and kind of goes from one really wild place to the next. And ever since then, the sandhill crane call in the spring has always been a really meaningful thing for me. So I look forward to that every year.
And it was a very special bird to author, naturalist, and conservationist Aldo Leopold.
Right. There's a great chapter in Sound County Almanac that talks about the music of the cranes, and that's also something that's really meaningful to me.
So maybe you can share a bit, having gone to law school and having thought about the law a lot, what you think of as what your view of the role of law in society is, especially a democratic one like ours, and how and why lawyers serve a critical purpose.
I think law is the great equalizer in a way in our country. I mean, there's obviously such huge disparities in wealth and power, but our aspiration is that the law applies equally to everyone. And that's kind of a uniquely American innovation. I mean, we're very fortunate in this country that every person has the right to bring the mightiest government that has ever existed on the face of the earth into a courtroom and make it answerable to the rule of law and kind of reasoned decision making. And in most other parts of the world, that's simply unheard of. But we have that right, and it's a core part of the functioning of our democracy. And I think in particular in the world that I operate in, environmental law, it's extremely meaningful because when the government takes actions affecting the environment, they have the entirety of the United States Department of Justice to stand up and represent them. And of course, the corporate interests that want to develop forests or waters or whatever it may be, they have the biggest, most powerful private law firms in the world to represent them. Mm-hmm. But the environment, the wildlife and the clean water and the clean air, there's nobody to stand up for them in the legal world unless somebody takes on that responsibility, and that's the mission of Earthjustice.
Well, it's a huge weight on all of your shoulders who work there, and a laudable mission, but a huge load to carry.
I mean, it's a weight, but it's also a privilege. Mm-hmm. There are a lot of people who have law degrees who are miserable mm-hmm. and don't find much satisfaction in their work, and I can honestly say that as I'm approaching 30 years into a legal career, that I feel very privileged to have a purposeful career and to be able to say that I can see where we've made a difference in things that I care deeply about. So mm-hmm. that's about as much as you can ask for.
Absolutely. So I was with you in the celebration of some of your victories, and they were big. Maybe you can share a story or two of some of your most satisfying or maybe surprise victories, and what the ingredients were that kind of brought that about.
Yeah. Well, I think at the apex for me is the Roadless Rule. Mm-hmm. This was a U.S. Forest Service initiative in the Clinton administration to protect the last 58.5 million acres of undeveloped and unprotected national forest lands from road construction and logging. And it was a landmark protection because the conservation movement had been fighting to protect these areas for decades. And suddenly here was this new layer of protection that was going to put them permanently off limits from road construction and logging. Unfortunately, that rule was finalized when the Clinton administration was on its way out the door and the George W. Bush administration was coming in. And of course, the opponents of the rule rushed into court to overturn it, and the George W. Bush administration refused to defend it. Mm-hmm. And so in that moment, it fell to Earthjustice, representing basically the public's interest in the forest in the form of a number of conservation groups, mm-hmm. stepped into the breach and did the job of the United States Justice Department to defend the Roadless Rule from this host of court attacks that were filed all around the country and went on over a period of more than a decade. Mm-hmm. And remarkably, I'm able to say that we ran the table in those cases and successfully defended the Roadless Rule every time it was challenged. And I remember when the Obama administration came into office, one of their officials was somewhat dubious about the Roadless Rule because they said, well, you're going to have to win every case, and how realistic is that? Mm-hmm. And as it turned out, it was very realistic because we did. And today the Roadless Rule remains the law of the land. Mm-hmm. Always it's up for grabs. I mean, always we have to defend it. It's never cemented in place without a threat. But today those roadless areas are protected. And that for me is kind of the apex of what I've been able to participate in at Earthjustice. And that involved not just this office in Bozeman, Montana. It involved Earthjustice offices in the Pacific Northwest and in Alaska and in California. And we scrambled all of our resources to defend that rule in every form where it was challenged. So it was both a fine hour for me in my legal career, but also one of the finest hours for Earthjustice. So it's extremely rewarding from that perspective.
Yes. One of the biggest days when that was finally won at last.
Yes.
But yes, you're right.
Sure.
It never rests. So you've litigated, Tim, over a long part of your career, a number of endangered species cases, including on wolves and grizzlies. And what, in your view, makes these kinds of cases different from others you may have worked on? And why do they matter to you?
Yeah. Well, there's so much of the planet that is controlled by humans. And we spend so much of our lives in environments that are totally controlled by humans. We live inside this human construct most of our lives now. And there's still a part of the planet that is not controlled by humans. And in the lower 48, in the West, in the northern Rockies in particular, the grizzly bear and the wolf they embody so much of that remainder of the self-willed landscape, the part of the world that humans cannot control. And that elicits strong emotional responses in my experience. It elicits great love and devotion from people who love wildness and wild places and everything that embodies about a world where everything is not under the thumb of some economic imperative or political demand. But it also inspires great hatred. Mm-hmm. There are people who have immense hatred for wolves and bears because they embody that. And either they resent or they don't feel comfortable with that whole concept, that idea that there's something that we shouldn't control or can't control. And so those cases bring out the strongest passions of anything that we work on. Mm-hmm. So many people have so much of their self-identity tied up in these issues, including myself. I mean, for me, those are powerful. The grizzly and the wolf are both really important, meaningful members of the ecological community, but I mean, to be candid, they're also really powerful symbols of something that matters still in the world, which is preserving a vestige of a wild landscape where life can kind of take its own course and everything doesn't have to be under the yoke of our economy and our politics. And that resonates through everything about those particular species, from politics to media to social response to the law, to the legal response. And those cases are always fraught with more kind of baggage than any others. And so I think you'll see when this Yellowstone grizzly bear case is argued in Missoula on August 30th, there will be an extraordinary turnout of members of the public who care a lot about it. There will be really unusual level of attention, and it's because of all the strong emotions that these cases inspire.
So in a few days, you're going to bring one of these very cases, arguing a major case on the Yellowstone grizzly bear in federal court in Missoula. The topic being whether endangered species protections should have been stripped from this bear population in 2017. And in effect, the court will decide, either that day or shortly after, whether or not Wyoming is going to be allowed to begin trophy hunting of grizzly bears on September 1st. So this is the second grizzly bear delisting case you've worked on, and you've worked on others. The last delisting case was a decade ago, and you and others at Earthjustice successfully restored protections for Yellowstone's grizzlies. How is this case different from what has happened in the past?
I mean, in my mind, this case represents the rubber hitting the road on the threats that we saw developing at the time of the first delisting case. The government moved to delist the Yellowstone grizzly population in 2007 in the face of a massive ecological shift in the Yellowstone region that was wiping out one of the bear's key food sources, which was the seeds of the whitebark pine tree. And everybody who lived here knew that was happening because all you had to do was look up on the ridge lines and you could see the red needles of all the dying trees. And the bears depended on those trees in the fall for a key part of their nutrition that would bulk them up enough to then go into their winter dens. And the Fish and Wildlife Service, the government agency that's responsible for protecting this species, was so committed to its delisting policy that, notwithstanding there was this huge shift that suddenly occurred at the 11th hour, they just bowled forward and finalized it. And we were able to bring that issue to the court, and we were successful in overturning their decision because they did blow past that critical issue about the future of grizzly bears in the region. Now, flash forward, and we're seeing the consequences of that massive die-off of a key food source because bears had to find something else to eat. And what they found to eat increasingly was meat. But that meat was in the form of remains left by hunters or livestock in many cases. And in both of those circumstances, that brought bears into conflict with people. It brought bears into conflict with hunters, where bears would maybe get mixed up with a hunter and be shot, or a hunter would perceive a threat and shoot in self-defense, or whatever it may be. But a lot of dead bears ended up showing up during the hunting seasons. And then there were a lot more bears being killed because of livestock conflicts. And so what we've seen is 2015, 2016, 2017, and now even more in 2018, unprecedented levels of grizzly bear mortalities in the Yellowstone ecosystem, because the bears are getting killed as they get into this much less secure landscape, trying to find meat as a food source to substitute for the loss of so many of their other key foods, including the whitebark pine. Now, the government, unfortunately, satisfied itself with saying, well, they found something else to eat, so they're fine. See, we knew there were more food out there, they're fine. What they didn't do was grapple with what are the consequences of that alternative food. What does it mean for bear survivorship and bear reproduction and loss of cubs when bears have to scrap it out over a bison carcass or maybe a livestock carcass? Mm-hmm. And so this time around, we're coming back to the court saying, here we go again, Judge. They blew off a key impact in their haste to get this rule across the finish line, and this time it was the mortality consequences of the major food shift that we saw underway in 2007.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. In the current case, you're representing Center for Biological Diversity and Sierra Club and National Parks and Conservation Association, but your lead client is the Northern Cheyenne tribe. So what here is the role of the tribe, and why is it important?
Yeah, it's a great honor to represent the Northern Cheyenne tribe in this case. Unlike all the other people who are interested in the grizzly bear, including myself, the tribe's interest in the grizzly bear literally goes back millennia. The grizzly bear has been a key aspect of their cultural and spiritual world for longer than, my ancestors have been on this continent. I'm not really in a position to speak to that. Really, the Cheyenne people should speak to that themselves, but I understand that it's really important and meaningful to them. Mm-hmm. And the idea for them that the grizzly bear is nothing more than another trophy animal that somebody will be able to hunt and, put in their den is, I know from my discussions with folks there, very disturbing. Apart from that cultural and spiritual interest, the Northern Cheyenne would love to see a future in which grizzly bears are once again a part of their natural world on the reservation, as they were historically. Mm-hmm. And that's not going to happen if all the bears on the periphery of the ecosystem are subject to hunting, as they will be under this post-delisting regime unless we're able to overturn it. So that's another key piece in the equation for the Northern Cheyenne, and it'll be a privilege to be able to stand up in court on their behalf.
So almost a decade ago, or actually 2 decades ago, I think maybe now, you became Office Manager of Earthjustice, expanding presence here in the Northern Rockies. Maybe you can share a bit about how the work of the attorneys in this office and in Earthjustice more broadly has been changing over time.
Well, when I came to this organization in 2000, the great bulk of our docket was devoted to land and wildlife issues. And a big chunk of our docket here in the Northern Rockies is still devoted to land and wildlife issues, because we're in the midst of this place where we're fortunate to have some of the premier wildlands owned by the public that remain in the world. But the other thing that's happened during the course of my time here is that climate change has become a huge issue that affects land and wildlife and all kinds of other things, including human communities and agriculture and water availability, and it's an existential threat to the society we've constructed, and it's also a big warning signal that society is not sustainable. And so in the Northern Rockies, we've tried to address that on every front, and that means both attacking the sources of greenhouse gases, and so we've worked to try to phase out coal combustion as an energy source, and at the same time trying to promote renewables, which there are great opportunities in the region for wind and solar that unfortunately are not being seized upon by the utilities and the regulators. And so we've established a big new part of our program that's focused on trying to make that transition. We're not just simply saying don't burn coal. We're saying don't burn coal. Instead, use the wind, use the sun, use other opportunities to generate electricity that don't cook the planet. Mm-hmm. And that's something that has to happen here, and it has to happen around the globe for us to succeed with that issue. Mm-hmm.
So your discussion about climate change gets us to this current administration, which is more than any other administration in the history of this country has been beavering away at unraveling environmental protections at virtually all levels. Even though the public has been shown time and time again that it overwhelmingly supports protection of the earth and species and clean air and water, So what are your thoughts on what is motivating President Trump and Republicans' current assault on the environment, especially given what Republicans did for the environment and environmental protections in the 1960s and 70s?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think I've really struggled with that. It's hard for me to understand what is motivating that. It's almost like a tribalism type response that environmental protection is part of the other side's agenda, so we're against it, period, regardless of any discussion on the merits. I hope that's not the case, but I will confess I don't understand a lot of what's motivating it. I will say that it's a key moment for the rule of law, because the presidency is a lost cause for environmental protection. The Congress at this moment of time is unwilling to stand up for even basic kinds of environmental initiatives like dealing with this overarching threat of climate change. And it's really fallen to the courts to be the last backstop for enforcing environmental law and imposing reasoned decision-making requirements instead of just allowing arbitrary whims to control. And we've seen the courts are stepping up to that challenge in many circumstances. And for our country, it's a key moment for the judiciary to stand as a safeguard of reason and democracy.
So, Tim, you have a daughter, Alex, who's back at college now. What kind of natural world do you think she and her kids and grandkids will inherit?
Well, it's something I worry a lot about. I think that it really depends on us. What we inherited in the Northern Rockies, for instance, none of it was by accident. We have Yellowstone National Park. We have the greater Yellowstone ecosystem with all the public lands surrounding the park and the big wilderness areas and the grizzly bears and the bison and the